10 minutes after my husband died, my children were already arguing over who would keep his watch. I still had my coffee cup in my hand, and my heart more or less where it had always been, on pause. Mark, the oldest, said the watch belonged to him because he was the firstborn and because Dad always said one day it would be mine. Lucy, the middle one, was crying without knowing why, with that way of crying that doesn't wet your eyes but fills everything with discomfort. And Andrew, the youngest, was laughing with a glass of whiskey at 9:30 in the morning, saying that at least the old man had had the decency to die on a weekday, so the wake wouldn't interrupt the weekend. That's how we are, I thought. A family perfectly trained to pretend. And there I was, in the kitchen, looking through the half-open door, listening to the sound of the clock, that damn clock that seemed to count the lies, piled up over a whole lifetime, and remembering the last thing he said to me before he died. Helen, please, make sure everything is in order. In order. What an obsession he had with order. I couldn't even cry for him. I didn't want to. Crying is a luxury when you've spent 45 years picking up the plates someone else lets fall. The house smelled of expensive flowers and stale air. The neighbors came and went with church faces. Some hugged me and told me he had been a great man. And I nodded, because that's what you do. But inside, something was boiling. Not rage, not sadness, something else. Something new, lukewarm, like water when it starts to boil but hasn't bubbled yet. Around 11, the priest Father Raphael, a man so kind it makes you want to push him, asked if I wanted to say a few words in front of the coffin. I told him no, that I had already said everything in life. And what I hadn't, better to keep quiet. He smiled with a sorry face and went on. Until, suddenly, he lifted a white envelope and announced that the deceased had left a letter for his children. A letter he asked to be read at his farewell, he said. And that was when all the air in the room stopped. No one breathed, me neither. Because that letter, the one he was about to read, had not been written by him. I wrote it. Dear children, the priest began with a trembling voice. If you are hearing these words, it means I can no longer speak to you in person. You will not receive anything we owned until you settle the moral debt you have with this family. You know what I mean. Mark snapped his head up as if someone had slapped him. Lucy covered her mouth with her hands. And Andrew let out a laugh so loud even the chandeliers shook. What a bastard, he said. Not even dead does he stop giving orders. The priest coughed, uncomfortable, and went on reading. What is not repaired will rot. Do not seek an inheritance before cleaning the memory. I trust you'll have the decency to do it. And it was signed, Arthur Sterling. I looked at him inside the coffin. So calm, so elegant, so dead. And inside I thought, you would have laughed, Arthur. You always loved having the last word. Before I go on with my story, I'm very curious to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to read you in the comments, because if you're listening to this, you probably know what it is to watch your own family act like vultures around something that hasn't even cooled yet. After the silence came chaos. Mark went out to the hallway to call his lawyer. Lucy kept asking over and over what that moral debt meant. And Andrew, well, Andrew was looking at me. With that half smile of his, half sarcasm and half tenderness, as if he suspected something. Carmen, my neighbor, came up to me slowly and whispered in my ear, "What did you do, Helen?" And I, without taking my eyes off the coffin, answered, "Nothing I shouldn't have done 30 years ago." The priest tried to calm everyone down, but it was already useless. My children were shouting at each other, the guests were whispering, and I watched everything from a corner, with my heart beating at last on its own. I thought of all the times I had to smile when I didn't want to, keep quiet when I should have spoken, apologize without guilt. And right there, in the middle of my husband's wake, I understood that the worst had already passed. When everyone left, I stayed alone. The house filled with that thick silence that only exists in places where there has been too much noise. I poured myself another coffee. I went up to the coffin. I rested my hand on the wood and whispered, "Rest easy, Arthur." I promise this time everything will be in order, but my way. And as I listened to the tick-tock of the clock, that damn clock they're all fighting over, I smiled. Because for the first time felt like it was mine. The next morning the coffee tasted different, more bitter, more free, as if the water had learned from me not to obey. I slept little, or not at all, because all night long I could hear my children's footsteps in the house. Sometimes they argued in low voices. Sometimes they went quiet, and I imagined their suspicious faces, their eyes doing the math, their heads spinning like human calculators. I got up before dawn, opened the living room curtains, and for the first time in many years, let all the light in without thinking whether he would approve or not. There was something strange about seeing the coffin covered by the flag of the club where he used to play when he was young. I had never liked that flag, but now I looked at it with a certain tenderness. It seemed like the perfect excuse to cover what was inside. Lucy was the first to come downstairs. Her eyes were swollen and her hair a mess, as if she had cried or pretended to cry all night. She asked if I wanted breakfast, and she made me laugh, because in this house I had always been the one who served breakfast, and now she, without knowing it, was rehearsing the role of mother she never wanted to be. I put the coffee pot on again, the sound of boiling water mixing with the murmur of the news on TV. Everything was about inflation, corruption, and inheritances. It felt like a joke from the universe. Mark showed up later, wearing a suit, his tie knot tighter than his patience. He sat in front of me without saying hello, opened a folder, and said we had to meet with the notary to clarify the legal situation of the assets. He used that expression, legal situation. He said it as if love, rage, and years could fit into an inventory. Andrew came in barefoot, with a piece of toast in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He told Mark that if the old man wanted to make them work from beyond the grave, he shouldn't count on him. Mark stood up, shouted something about respect, and I, caught between them, listened to the dead man's clock ticking like a slow, mocking applause. I asked them to sit down. I told them it was going to be a long day, and that it was best to eat something before they went on destroying each other. No one moved. Lucy cried. Andrew smiled. Mark breathed like a bull before charging. That's who we were. And inside, I thought that the letter had done exactly what I wanted. Moved the stone that covered the swamp. I didn't know how far it would go, but at last the silence had been broken. I served them coffee, sat down, and watched how they avoided looking at one another. No one spoke for several minutes. The whole house seemed to be holding its breath. When Mark finally broke the silence, it was to say he had checked the safe in the study and the will wasn't there. He stared at me, waiting for me to be shocked, but he failed. Lucy asked if he thought Dad had changed his mind. He replied that his father never changed his mind, and that, although none of us said it, made us all think the same thing, that someone had meddled with something. I took a sip of coffee and said, as naturally as possible, that the notary would know where it was. That not everything important is kept under lock and key. The sun was coming in through the window, and for the first time in years, I realized how ugly the dining room colors were. That mix of beige and brown he loved so much looked to me now like the uniform of resignation. While Mark talked about properties and percentages, I was thinking about painting the walls green, taking down the pictures, opening the windows. I caught myself imagining a house without his shadow, without his voice ordering everything, and that thought made me a little scared and a little amused. Scared because I never knew how to live alone. Amused because somehow I was already doing it. Lucy asked me if I knew anything about the letter. She said it with that fragile voice of hers from when she was little, and broke something and wanted to confess but not all the way. I told her no, that her father was capable of anything, even talking from beyond the grave. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and murmured that she wished he had really said goodbye. Andrew burst out laughing and said the letter was his goodbye, and that if Dad had left them with a moral debt, it was surely because he'd done something dirty while he was alive. Mark shouted at him to be careful with what he was implying. Meanwhile, I was counting spoonfuls of sugar in my head so I wouldn't step in. Later, when they all went out, I cleared the plates and half-empty glasses. At the bottom of the last one, I found the butt of a smoked-out cigarette. I don't know why I kept it in the pocket of my apron, as if it were a relic. Maybe because that smell of tobacco reminded me of something close to freedom. I stayed alone in the kitchen, the radio on, and I laughed to myself, remembering their faces when the priest read the letter. The moral debt, they repeated it as if it were a curse. And I, while washing the dishes, thought the debt wasn't with their father, but with me. I went up to the bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept the things he never checked. A sewing kit, some old letters, a crumpled envelope. The envelope that held the draft of that letter. I took it out, smoothed it on the bed, and read it slowly. Every word held my breath inside it. There was no resentment, no revenge, only truth. The truth I never had the courage to say out loud. That letter was my voice, my way of no longer being invisible. I had placed it inside the coffin with a kind of animal calm, like someone burying a secret they don't want to rise again. That night, while the clock struck 10 and the silence stretched through the whole house, I thought again about my children. About how quickly they'd forgotten that I was also there, alive, breathing. I thought that, deep down, the letter was for them. That all this comedy of inheritances and wills was just an excuse to force them to look at themselves, to discover who they were without their father's mirror. I sat on the bed, turned off the lamp, and said softly, as if someone might hear me, "The letter wasn't his, it was mine. And this time I'm not going to regret it." I slept with the feeling that, finally, something had begun to move. I didn't know whether toward calm or toward disaster, but it was moving, and that was enough. The notary came 3 days later, at the hour when the sun comes in sideways through the living room curtains and turns everything amber, as if the house wanted to pretend it was still respectable. His name was Galdwin, a man in his mid-50s, with that kind of voice that always sounds like it's apologizing even when it hasn't done anything. He came with his leather briefcase, his jacket a bit too tight, and a faint smell of cheap cologne mixed with paper. He said he needed to talk to the family to go over the documents still pending. I offered him coffee out of habit, not kindness, and told him to sit on the sofa, the same one where Arthur used to read the newspaper in silence, pretending the world only mattered to him as long as it didn't change the order of the headlines. Mark appeared immediately, punctual, with that urgency of someone afraid of losing something that isn't his yet. Lucy arrived later, with a distant look and a low voice, as if she were dragging the guilt of having been born in the middle. Andrew, of course, came in barefoot, a cigarette tucked behind his ear and a smile that challenged the rules of mourning. The three of them sat down in front of the notary, and I stayed standing, behind them, like the ghost of the housekeeper. I listened as the man opened the folder and began to talk about pending documents, death certificates, and last known will. It all sounded like procedures and numbers, but under each word there was a tremor we all felt. No one knew where the official will of Arthur Sterling was. The notary said he had been notified of the existence of a will signed 2 years ago, but that in his records the final copy was missing, the one that should have been kept in the safe in the dead man's study. Mark interrupted him irritably, insisting that he himself had searched every drawer and found only worthless papers. Lucy, always eager to soften things, said maybe their father had moved it. And Andrew, from the corner, threw his line like a stone. Or maybe Dad never wrote anything, and the letter was his moral will, the one that really matters. The notary looked at him, uncomfortable, not knowing whether to laugh or write that down in his notebook. I smiled silently, because Andrew's irony was the only honest thing in that room. The man cleared his throat and said that, according to his records, there was a second mention of an alternate document, dated barely 6 months before my husband's death. No one spoke. On the table, the only sound was the click of the pen Mark was pressing without realizing it. Galdwin said that second document was pending validation, which in his language meant it existed but couldn't be found. I, who knew perfectly well where it was, felt a slight heat rise up my back. I had kept that red envelope in a drawer in my wardrobe, along with old letters I never dared throw away. I hadn't done it out of greed, but instinct. Part of me was afraid that if that paper saw the light, everything would dissolve. The lie, the justice, the little piece I had managed to build. While the men talked about signatures and seals, I got lost in my own memories. I saw Arthur's face in front of me. That night he forced me to sign a power of attorney in his name in case something happened. I remembered the sound of his voice telling me I shouldn't worry about papers, that men took care of those things. And I also remembered the first time I thought about killing him, not with a weapon or poison, but with silence, with distance, with a letter that would say what could never be said aloud. That letter was my way of killing him without touching him. Baldwin asked if I remembered seeing any similar document in the house. I replied that no, that my husband never let me near his things. I told the truth, but I also lied. Exactly half of every sentence was true, and that gave me a strange calm, like walking on the edge of a roof without fear of falling. Lucy looked at me gratefully, or so I wanted to believe. Andrew didn't look at me. He seemed focused on his cigarette ash, thinking about who knows what. Mark didn't stop talking about succession rights and the moral obligation to preserve the estate. Big words to hide his panic. When the notary left, leaving us a list of documents he had to review at his office, the house felt quieter than ever. Lucy went up to her father's bedroom to look for photo albums. Mark locked himself in the study, and Andrew went out to the garden to smoke. I stayed in the living room, staring at the notary's empty folder and thinking about how absurd it all was. So many years of control, of orders, of fear, to end like this, with 3 lost adults looking for papers as if salvation were written on them. When the clock struck 6, I went up to the room and opened the drawer. There was the red envelope. I touched it without opening it, just to feel its weight, that small weight that can change an entire life. I thought about hiding it somewhere else, but I couldn't move. I stayed there, my fingers on the paper, and remembered a phrase Arthur used to repeat when he wanted to scare me. "Nothing escapes my control, Helen." How ironic. He couldn't even control his own death. At dusk, Lucy came down with an album and asked me to help her sort photos for the memorial. We sat on the floor, among faded portraits and fake smiles. In one of the pictures, he was holding her as a child, lifting her in his arms, and for a second, I thought I saw tenderness in his gesture. Lucy told me that sometimes she thought Dad didn't love them as much as he pretended, and I replied that her father loved everyone in his own way, that what he didn't know was how to show it without causing harm. It was the closest thing to forgiveness I could give her. That night, when everyone was asleep, I went downstairs barefoot to the living room. Outside it was raining, and the sound of water against the windows reminded me of summers when I still believed life was a safe place. I turned on a lamp and looked at the red envelope on the table. I opened it. Inside was the real will, the last one, the one that said everything was left in my name with a handwritten note. She will know what to do with what's ours. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I only felt a slight knot in my stomach, something between relief and fear. I folded it again, put it back in the envelope and closed it. I wasn't ready to show it. Not yet. Let them devour one another a little longer. I poured myself a glass of wine, turned off the lights, and, before going upstairs, I thought that maybe, after all, the real will wasn't that paper, but the letter resting beside his body. The only truth no one would ever fully know how to read. The smell of rain still lingered in the house when Mark appeared at 9 in the morning with the look of someone coming to announce a war. He walked in without knocking, his tie crooked and his phone glued to his ear, talking about lawyers, rights, preventive measures. He didn't say hello. He said something about the notary and about a missing document, and that he had the right to search the wardrobes, the drawers, everything. I watched him silently, coffee cup in my hands. I thought that this man was the son of my body, but also of the fear I had had for so many years. When he hung up, he looked at me with that mix of superiority and annoyance his father used to use to tame me, and said that the chaos we were living through was the fault of silence. And I, who had already decided not to keep quiet anymore, answered slowly, almost in a whisper, Sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps you alive. While he kept talking, Lucy came down the stairs with swollen eyes and an album under her arm. She'd spent the whole night looking at photos, searching for signs that her father had ever loved her. She said she'd dreamed of him, that he asked for her forgiveness, that he spoke of a house by the sea that never existed. Mark cut her off impatiently and started saying that none of that mattered, that the only real thing was the will, and that until it showed up, no one should touch a single painting or chair. Andrew appeared at that moment, with a scarf around his neck and an unlit cigarette. He said that if Mark wanted to play detective, he could count on him for the suspect role. I almost laughed, but held back. The tension between them was so dense that every word felt like a spark on gasoline. They spent the morning searching through the house as if the will were a piece of gold hidden among the furniture. I watched them open drawers, move boxes, argue over anything. Lucy found a box of old letters and started reading them without understanding they weren't hers. They were mine. They were the remains of my days of obedience, of my habit of writing in secret so I wouldn't scream. Mark asked me for the keys to the wardrobe in my bedroom. I told him no, that there were still things in that house that were mine. He answered that, "Nothing is just yours, Mother," and that Mother said with poison gave me more strength than any insult. I replied that then nothing was just his either, not even his surname, because the father's name no longer meant what he thought. I went out to the garden to breathe. The air smelled of wet earth and eucalyptus. Carmen, my neighbor, appeared on the other side of the fence in her flowered robe with a cigarette hanging from her lips. She asked if they had stopped arguing yet. I told her no, that hell was just getting started. She laughed and offered me a sip of herbal liqueur from a little bottle she kept in her pocket. She told me her husband had also left a mess when he died, although in his case, it wasn't a fortune but debts. "It doesn't matter if they leave gold or misery, Helen. In the end, what's always inherited is resentment," she said, and she was right. I stayed a while talking to her, listening to the rain start up again on the roof, and thinking that maybe the only sane person left in my world was that neighbor with dyed red hair. When I went back to the living room, the three of them were surrounded by papers. Mark was on the phone with the notary, Lucy was crying, and Andrew had fallen asleep on the sofa with a half-smoked cigarette. The air smelled of exhaustion. I walked up, slowly, and told them to stop, that they were searching for something they wouldn't find that way, because what was missing wasn't lost, it was waiting. They stared at me, without understanding. Lucy asked me to explain what I meant. I told them their father had always kept the most important things in the most obvious places, but that this time, maybe he had decided to hide the truth where we least expected it, in each of our memories. Andrew shot me an ironic look and said, "Wow, Mom, you sound like a soap opera medium." I shrugged. I wasn't offended. He didn't know how close he was to being right. After lunch, the house fell silent. Mark locked himself in the study again, and Lucy went out to walk in the rain. Andrew stayed with me in the kitchen. He asked for a coffee, and asked if I thought his father had anything else to hide. I told him we all do, and his father was no exception. "And you?" he asked. "What are you hiding, Mom?" I told him nothing worth finding. He laughed, but his eyes changed, became serious, and at that moment I knew for sure he was starting to suspect. I served him his coffee and changed the subject. I told him I'd found some old letters from a woman who used to work for us, Julia, the one who took care of him when he was a child. His face brightened a little. He remembered her smell of lavender, her soft laugh. He said he had loved her very much. I nodded and told him his father had fired her for no reason, that it had been unfair. I didn't say more. I didn't tell him the moral debt in the letter was because of her. That night, while the others slept, I stayed in the kitchen with a candle lit. Outside, the trees swayed as if the wind wanted to rip the gilt from their branches. I thought of Julia, of the son she had and that Arthur never wanted to acknowledge. I thought of what the word inheritance meant and how little it had to do with money. The house still smelled of damp and broken promises. I closed the notary's folder they'd left open on the table, and there, among the papers, I found an old photo, Arthur holding a baby that wasn't any of my children. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel anger, just a kind of confirmation. Maybe that was the real debt. Maybe that's why my letter worked like a broken mirror, because each of them saw in it what they feared most. I went up the stairs without turning on the light. The hallway creaked under my feet as if the house were breathing. At the bedroom door I stopped, listened to my children's distant voices arguing even in their sleep. I thought of opening the drawer and taking out the red envelope, of showing it to them all and ending the performance. But no, not yet. I lay down without taking off my clothes, staring at the ceiling, feeling the air vibrate differently, as if someone, maybe me, had just released something that had been locked up for years. It wasn't sleep that was coming for me, it was vertigo, and I let myself fall into it without closing my eyes. Morning came with a false clarity, the kind that tricks your eyes into believing the world has calmed down when really everything is about to explode. I went down to the kitchen, still in my robe, and with a tiredness that wasn't from lack of sleep, but from thinking. I had left the candle burning all night, and it had melted down to a small stain of wax on the table, like a tiny sign that something had happened while we slept. The sound of the study door pulled me out of my thoughts. Mark was already awake, going through papers, speaking in a low voice on the phone. He did it with the same intensity his father used to close deals, a mix of arrogance and desperation. Lucy came down shortly after, her face pale and her expression somewhere between embarrassed and sad. She was holding a yellowed letter she'd found in one of the albums, addressed to Julia. She handed it to me without a word. I read it slowly, feeling how each line opened a hole in the air. It was a letter from Arthur, written more than 30 years ago, where he acknowledged having committed an unforgivable injustice against someone who had helped him build his life. He spoke of a moral debt, of a promise he never kept, of a child he walked away from out of cowardice. Lucy asked who that woman was, and I told her she had worked for us, that she had been fired without cause, that life had treated her badly. I didn't say more, but she noticed the tremor in my hands. Mark burst into the kitchen, snatched the letter, and read it impatiently. His face hardened when he reached the end. "What is this?" he asked, as if someone were obliged to protect him from the truth. "Proof that Dad wasn't a saint," said Andrew from the doorway, with that half-smile that seemed to understand everything before anyone else. Mark turned on him furiously and shouted for him to be careful, not to dare stain his father's memory. Andrew shrugged, and I replied that he wasn't staining it, that the memory was already born dirty. Lucy cried again, in that silent way of hers that hurts me more than shouting. I let them argue. While they hurled words at each other like stones, I understood that Arthur's letter was the beginning of the end, the mirror where they would all truly see themselves. I started thinking about Julia and her son, about what became of them, about how that story had been buried, along with all the other things I never dared say. I remembered her grateful look when she thanked me the day she was fired, her trembling voice promising me that one day the truth would come out. Sometimes life takes its time, but it keeps its word. After breakfast, the three of them left for the notary's office. Mark wanted to check whether the letter was related to the missing papers. Lucy insisted on putting it back where she had found it, and Andrew said the whole thing was a soap opera about badly raised dead people. I stayed alone. Again, with the house full of echoes and traces of other people's footsteps, I went to the wardrobe, took out the red envelope, and put it on the table. I looked at it for a long time without touching it. I felt my heart pounding with the urgency of those days when you have to decide whether to keep being an accomplice or finally start being guilty of something. The sound of the doorbell startled me. It was Galdwin, the notary. He came in with an expression of professional curiosity and a tiredness he couldn't hide. He told me he'd been reviewing the records and found a note mentioning a pending donation from Arthur Sterling to a woman named Julia Rivers. His voice was careful, but I could hear the blade behind each word. I invited him in, served coffee, and listened as he explained his discovery. He said the donation had never been completed, that the file remained open, and that the amount was considerable. He asked if I knew that woman. I told him yes, that she had worked in the house many years ago, that I vaguely remembered her. He watched me with those gray eyes of his, the kind that try to read between the lines, and wrote something down in a notebook. "There's something else," he said before leaving. "I found out the woman had a child, but the father's name doesn't appear on the record. If Mr. Sterling was trying to repair some damage, perhaps that's where the explanation lies." I nodded without looking at him. I didn't even want to ask. I walked him to the door, and when he left, I locked it. The whole house seemed to sigh. In the afternoon, Lucy came back with a distraught face. She told me that at the notary's office they had confirmed the same thing, that her father had had a pending debt with that woman, and that the document spoke of repairing a family wrong. "What wrong, Mom?" she asked. "What did Dad do?" I told her I didn't know, that maybe one day we'd understand. There was no point telling her the truth. Not yet. That night, the three of them gathered in the dining room. Mark talked about clearing his father's name, about finding that woman or her family and paying whatever was necessary to put an end to the matter. Lucy said she wanted to find them, to ask for forgiveness. Andrew laughed, saying there isn't enough money to wipe clean the guilt of a man who dies without telling the truth. They argued until late, and I watched them with a mix of pride and sadness. For the first time in a long time, they were speaking from the heart, even if it was only to hurt each other. When they finally fell silent, I picked up the glasses, washed the dishes, and stood at the window staring at the reflection of my wrinkled hands. I thought of Julia, of her son, of how time turns injustice into inheritance. I remembered what Carmen said the other day. It doesn't matter if they leave gold or misery, resentment is always inherited. And I realized she was right. What I had left inside the coffin wasn't a letter, it was a seed, and now it was sprouting. I sat in the dark without turning on the lights and thought about the inevitable. If they kept tugging at that thread, sooner or later they'd get to me. And maybe that was fair. Maybe the time had come for someone to know that not everything inherited weighs on the dead. Some burdens are chosen by the living, and sometimes the only way to pay a moral debt is to say out loud the name you've spent years avoiding, Julia. The doorbell rang before dawn, 3 sharp knocks that sounded like they came from another era. I took a while to get up. I thought it was the wind, or maybe an impatient neighbor. When I opened the door, Notary Galdwin was there with a wet coat and a face that mixed sleep and urgency. He said he needed to talk to me, without the presence of your children. He looked at me with respect, but also with the caution of someone stepping into a minefield. I led him into the kitchen. I made coffee in silence while he took a damp-stained envelope out of his folder. "We found it in the bank's old archives," he said. "Your husband tried to open an account in the name of a woman, Julia Rivers, but it was never completed. There's a letter attached, written in his own hand. I didn't touch it." The envelope sat there between us, and just looking at it was enough to feel the house fill with ghosts. Galdwin watched me, waiting for a reaction, but I only asked if he'd already read it. He nodded and told me the letter mentioned a child, that Arthur spoke of his guilt, of the need to set something right before dying. I asked if the kids knew anything, and he said not yet. That he wanted to speak to me first because there were delicate details he'd rather not make public without my permission. He looked straight at me, with genuine respect, and added in a low voice, "You know more about this than you let on, don't you?" I smiled calmly, the kind of smile you learn. After years of marriage to a man who confused power with affection, I told him that at my age one doesn't pretend anything anymore. One simply learns to keep quiet about what others wouldn't be able to bear. After he left, I stayed staring at the envelope on the table. Outside, it was starting to rain again. That kind of rain that doesn't clean but pushes the dirt into the corners. The house was silent. The kids were sleeping. I thought about opening the letter, but I didn't. There was something sacred about not knowing everything all at once, about letting the truth seep in slowly, like damp in the walls. I poured another coffee and stood by the window, watching the first rays of sun mix with the water and turn the garden into a dirty mirror. Around mid-morning, Mark came into the kitchen, shirt wrinkled and eyes bloodshot with lack of sleep. He said he'd spent the night talking to a lawyer friend, that things could get complicated if the notary found irregularities. Lucy came down after him with an absent look, as if her mind were somewhere else. Andrew was last, saying nothing, just lighting a cigarette and sitting in front of me. He stared at me for a long time before speaking. "The notary came to see you early, didn't he?" He didn't say it like a question. "He saw you from the study window," he added. I didn't answer. I just poured more coffee into his cup. He insisted. What did he want? I told him he was just going over documents. "Don't lie to me, Mom," he said, and in that moment his voice sounded so much like his father's that I had to look away. "I don't like it when you do that, Andrew," I replied. "When you use his tone, it doesn't suit you." He shrugged, but didn't look away. There was something new in the way he looked at me, a mix of tenderness and suspicion that disarmed me. Lucy jumped in to change the subject, talking about going to the cemetery, about putting flowers, about doing something that might bring peace. No one replied. Mark only muttered that peace doesn't pay the bills. The day went by in a blur of papers, whispers, and footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I thought I heard Arthur speaking from some corner, that deep voice of his ordering, demanding, correcting. Sometimes I even answered him silently, as if I still needed to argue with him to stay alive. In the afternoon, Carmen, my neighbor, called and asked me to come down for a bit. "Your voice sounds strange," she said. I told her it was tiredness. "Tiredness has many faces," she replied. I went anyway. Her kitchen smelled of soup and tobacco. She poured me a glass of wine and asked if I already knew about Julia's son. I felt my heart pound in my chest. "The whole neighborhood's talking," she added. "They say the boy had the same eyes as you." I didn't know what to say. I stared at my glass, at the way the wine caught the light from the window. Carmen put her hand on mine and said, in a low voice, "Sometimes a truth doesn't destroy Helen, it just finally puts things where they belong." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. When I got back, the house was in semi-darkness. Lucy was asleep on the sofa, Mark was arguing on the phone again, and Andrew was in the yard, smoking in the rain. I went over to him. He didn't look at me. He just said the notary had called, that he wanted to gather the family the next day to clarify some documents. "Did he say which ones?" I asked. "No," he replied. "But he said it all started with a letter." I stood still, feeling the wind press my clothes to my body. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. Andrew crushed his cigarette under his shoe and finally looked at me. "Dad didn't write that letter, did he?" It wasn't an accusation, it was recognition. "Don't say silly things," I answered, calmer than I felt. But he smiled, without irony this time, and said slowly, "If you wrote it, you did the right thing. Somebody had to." I didn't know whether to hug him or run away. I stayed there, in the rain, feeling the weight of that half-confession hanging between us. It was the first time in many years that someone told me I had done something right. When we went back inside, Mark was still on the phone. He was using words like fraud, review, possible forgery. Lucy was sleeping deeply, oblivious to everything. I went up to my room quietly, closed the door, and dropped into my chair. The red envelope was still there, waiting for me, like a temptation. I opened it slowly. I read again the sentence written in Arthur's hand. "She will know what to do with what's ours." And I understood that I had done it, that my whole life had been preparing me for that moment. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone stopped at my door, breathed, and then walked away. I didn't go out. I stayed still, the envelope in my hands, and I thought that truth has a curious way of announcing itself. It never arrives all at once. It seeps in, it slides. It forces you to decide whether you're going to keep holding up the world as it is or dare to turn it with your own hands. And that night, I knew I wasn't going to hold anything up anymore. Morning slid through the house like a cold current, quiet but with that electricity that comes before a storm. No one spoke during breakfast. Spoons clinked against cups, and the silence felt like it had edges. Mark was scrolling through documents on his phone. Lucy stared out the window without seeing anything, and Andrew was just tracing circles with his finger on the table. I tried to act natural, but the word meeting floated in the air like a threat. The notary had summoned us all for that afternoon, and although no one said it, we knew it was going to be a trial. Not just of Arthur and his secrets, but of mine too. After coffee, everyone went their own way. Mark locked himself in the study. Lucy went up to her room, and Andrew followed me into the kitchen. He held his unlit cigarette in his hand like a charm. He asked if I was nervous. I told him that at my age, you only get nervous over what you didn't do, not over what you're about to do. He laughed, a low, almost conspiratorial laugh. He said he'd spent the night thinking about the letter, about Julia, about the child his father might have had. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he asked if I thought the boy was still alive. I told him yes, surely yes, because truths that are denied for so long always find a way to keep breathing. Andrew nodded slowly and went over to the window. He told me he used to dream about Julia when he was a child, that he remembered her perfume and a song she used to hum. He said that in the dream she told him not to worry, that truth doesn't kill, it just rearranges the pieces. He sounded so sure that I had to turn to look at him properly. There was something different in his face, something that wasn't doubt but a kind of clarity. What if I were that son? He asked suddenly. Time stopped. I felt the floor breathing under my feet. Don't say that, I murmured, but my voice sounded hollow. He looked at me intently. It's not crazy, Mom. You knew, didn't you? You always knew. I didn't know what to answer. I walked over to the coffee maker, pretending to look for something I didn't need. He didn't move. Don't say it, Andrew, I said at last. Some things can't be fixed with words. He stepped closer and put a hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell anyone. I just want to understand who I am. And he left, leaving behind the smell of tobacco and a feeling of emptiness that took a while to fade. The rest of the day dragged on. Lucy went out without saying where, and Mark stayed holed up in the study. At 4 o'clock, the notary arrived with his briefcase and a tired expression. He sat in the living room and laid some documents on the table. He didn't beat around the bush. He said that, after reviewing the files, he had found evidence that Arthur Sterling had tried to recognize a child outside of marriage, but had never formalized it. He explained that the inheritance could get complicated, that it would be necessary to determine the legitimacy of the heirs. Mark jumped up, outraged. Lucy covered her face with her hands. Andrew remained still. I said nothing. Baldwin went on. There's something else. According to a handwritten note, Mr. Sterling expressly asked that the family take it upon themselves to repair the moral harm done. He is not talking about money, but memory. He paused, looking at each of us in turn. And one more thing. The letter read at the funeral doesn't match the style or handwriting of the deceased. The air froze. Mark slammed his hand on the table and demanded an explanation. Lucy mumbled something about misunderstandings, and Andrew, in a calm voice, said, My mother wrote that letter. The notary turned his head toward me, unsurprised, as if he'd already suspected it. Mark shouted my name, begged me to deny it, but I didn't. I just held his gaze and breathed. Yes, I wrote it, I said. And I did it because someone had to. The silence that followed was so long that I could hear the tick-tock of the hallway clock. Mark called me crazy, Lucy asked me to explain. Andrew simply stood up and went out to the garden. The notary closed his folder gently, as if he had just witnessed something too human to be put into a record. He said he needed time to review the new documents and left. Lucy hugged me in tears. I didn't know if out of compassion or shame. Mark stormed upstairs, shouting that I had destroyed the family legacy. When the sound of his footsteps faded, I stayed alone in the living room, staring at the table covered in papers. I went out to the garden. Andrew was, sitting in the fine rain, elbows on his knees. I approached without speaking. Why didn't you say anything before? He asked. Because no one would have wanted to hear it, I replied. Your father wouldn't let me talk, and you all learned to hear only what suited you, so I chose to write it instead. Andrew smiled sadly. So it was your will, not his. I nodded. Yes, the only one that was really mine. We stayed silent. The rain soaked us, but it no longer mattered. For the first time, I felt the weight of the secret begin to lift. I asked if he hated me. No, he said. I understand you. I think now I understand many things. I hugged him, and it was a hug without promises, just a truce. That night the house was quiet, too quiet. Lucy didn't come down for dinner, Mark didn't leave his room, and Andrew stayed with me, making tea in the kitchen. He told me he had found an old drawing of his in the attic, from when he was a child. Him and Julia in the garden, she wearing a straw hat. I didn't know I'd drawn her so many times, he said. Sometimes memory paints what the heart doesn't want to forget, I replied. When I went up to my room, the mirror showed me a face I didn't recognize. I didn't look guilty anymore. I looked relieved. I thought of Arthur, of Julia, of all the silences that had held this house together. I had made mistakes, yes, but at least one of them had opened a crack for the truth to come through. I turned off the light, but not to sleep. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, firm. Andrew walked past my door and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." I didn't answer. I just closed my eyes and thought that, for the first time in many years, someone had thanked me without demanding anything in return. News of the confession spread through the family like a slow poison, and over the next few days, the house seemed to fill with echoes and absences. Mark stopped talking to me altogether. He spent his mornings locked in the study with endless calls to lawyers and notaries, mumbling short, almost always furious phrases. Lucy, on the other hand, moved with a new tenderness, as if she were afraid that anything she said might break me and that hurt me more than her brother's shouting. Andrew came and went without warning, showing up with a bag of bread, a bottle of wine, or a look that spoke of tiredness and relief at the same time. He had learned how to keep quiet without hiding, a skill his father never understood. One afternoon, as the winter light filtered obliquely through the blinds, Baldwin came back. He held an envelope in his hand and wore an expression that was half cautious, half curious. He said he had found the original will of Arthur Sterling among the notary archives. He asked me to gather the family, that it was important for everyone to be present. I felt my heart beating with a strange slowness, as if it wanted to be certain of each beat before giving the next one. I called Mark, Lucy, and Andrew, and when they were all there, the notary opened the envelope and began to read. The document was brief, almost terse. It left all assets, properties, and accounts in my name. No conditions, no clauses, no warnings, only one line at the end written in his own hand. She will know what to do with what's ours. No one spoke. The sound of the paper folding was the only thing that broke the silence. Mark was the first to react. His voice came out filled with disbelief and rage. He said it was impossible, that his father would never have done that there had to be some mistake, some manipulation. Lucy cried quietly, as if that sentence, instead of making her angry, freed her from something. Andrew barely smiled, with that calm that seems to come from an old acceptance. The notary closed his folder with a measured gesture, said the will was legal, that the signatures had been verified, that there was nothing to argue. Mark cut in, shouting that he would check every document, that he wouldn't accept an injustice. I looked at him and told him the only injustice was to keep fighting with a dead man. He got up, kicked a chair, and left without looking back. Lucy tried to stop him, but he didn't listen. The three of us, Andrew, Lucy, and I, remained in the living room, with silence beating between us. Lucy asked what I was going to do with everything, and I told her I still didn't know, maybe nothing, that all I wanted was for the house to stop smelling of fear. Andrew told me you don't get that by selling furniture or signing papers, but by stopping obeying ghosts. He said it softly, without reproach. I nodded, understanding that each of us was trying to survive in our own way. That night I turned on all the lights in the house, one by one, and opened the windows. I wanted the air to move, for the darkness to be chased from the corners. Lucy helped me in silence, pulling back curtains, lighting candles, letting the dust rise, and show the trail of time. At some point, without planning it, we opened the study wardrobe and started going through Arthur's things. Documents, trophies, notebooks with figures, letters. Among them, Lucy found a photograph, him with a small boy who wasn't any of my children. She stared at it for a long time, then handed it to me. I said nothing. I placed it on the table next to the will. Mark came back late that night, his face contorted. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer and was planning to contest the will. I told him he could if that gave him peace, but it wouldn't change anything. Then he came closer, very close, and in a voice that mixed anger and fear told me, "Dad was right. You never understood your place." I held his gaze without moving and replied, "Maybe, Mark. What I never understood was why yours was the only place that mattered." There was a second of silence before Lucy stepped between us, trembling. Andrew, from the doorway, said that was enough, that we were all tired of repeating the father's story without realizing it. Mark left again, and this time I knew he wouldn't be back anytime soon. I stared at the fire in the fireplace and thought that even though the will changed everything, it also left everything the same. The house was still full of the same absences, but now they had names. The inheritance wasn't the money or the properties, but that air of fulfilled secrets that suddenly weighed less. The next day, the notary stopped by early to drop off the signed documents. He shook my hand before leaving and, in a low voice, said something that would stay with me a long time. "Not all wills are written on paper, Mrs. Sterling. Some are written in what one decides not to say." I nodded without answering. I watched him walk away down the stone path, his figure fading into the fog. Lucy found me in the dining room with the will on the table. She asked if I was going to put it away. I told her no, that I preferred to leave it there, in plain sight, so no one would forget that even the dead can change their minds. She smiled sadly and hugged me. In her voice there was a forgiveness that didn't need words. Andrew walked in with a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. The 3 of us sat down in silence, without toasting, without planning anything, just letting time keep going. That night, when I went up to my room, the air felt different. Not peace, but something close. I opened the window and breathed in the cold. I thought of Arthur, of Julia, of the child in the photo, of all the things life leaves half-finished. I remembered the notary's words and knew he was right. Some wills aren't signed. They are lived, undone, released. I closed my eyes and, for the first time, felt the future was no longer a debt. Winter began to creep into the house with the same slowness with which memories slip in when you try to keep them away. The wind slipped through the gaps in the windows, the smell of dried flowers, mixed with old wax, and every step down the hallway sounded different, as if the house now had a breath of its own. Mark didn't come back after that night. His absence wasn't silence. It was a dull noise hovering between the walls, the murmur of something that almost broke but didn't. Lucy spent the afternoons tending to the plants, talking to the leaves as if they were people, and Andrew had moved into the attic, where he spent hours drawing, smoking, listening to old music. I let them be, watched them without interfering, because I had learned that sometimes love means not asking anything. One day I got a letter from the cemetery. They informed me that Arthur's remains had to be moved to the family crypt, and that if we wished we could take advantage of the transfer to have one last ceremony before the final cremation. Lucy said she wanted to do it, that it was the right thing. Andrew, without looking at her, muttered that nothing involving that man could be right. I kept quiet. I knew that beyond the ceremony, what we were really looking for was a way to close the story, even if it was a lie. I agreed. That afternoon, while we organized the paperwork, I opened the wardrobe where I kept his suits and was struck by the smell of dust, old cologne. Time stopped. Between the lapels of one of the coats, I found a folded sheet. I opened it carefully. It was a letter I had written many years before, during one of our crises. I told him I didn't want to go on being a shadow, that I needed to get my name back, my voice. I never gave it to him. Remembering those words left me with a feeling of warmth and guilt at once. I realized that my whole life had been full of letters that never reached their destination. When the day of the transfer came, the sky was gray, but it wasn't raining. The cemetery smelled of damp earth and cheap incense. It was just the three of us and a couple of workers. Lucy held the flowers with trembling hands. Andrew smoked non-stop, and I felt a weight in my chest that wasn't pain, but a mix of relief and vertigo. The coffin was covered in dust. I asked for a moment before they sealed it for good. I walked up, ran my hand over the wood, and without anyone noticing, slipped the letter I'd found in the coat inside. I folded it again and placed it among the flowers. I said nothing. No one asked. Lucy prayed under her breath, and for a moment I heard her say something that surprised me. She asked for her father to rest, but also for us to be able to. Andrew stepped away and lit another cigarette. "You know what I think, Mom?" he said, still not looking at me. "This funeral isn't for him. It's for us." I nodded. He was right. It was our way of burying what was left of everything that had no name, no forgiveness, no explanation. When the fire in the furnace started, the air filled with a dry, metallic heat. I stared at the flame without looking away. I didn't feel horror. What I saw was a kind of purification, a truth finally taking physical form. As the smoke rose, I remembered each of his gestures in life, his rigidity, his authoritarian voice, his long, calculated silences. And without knowing why, I thanked him in a low voice, not for what he was, but for what his absence had allowed, the chance to start existing. After the crematorium, Lucy insisted we go for a drink, so we wouldn't go back to the house with that direct emptiness. The three of us went to a small bar by the river. There was a TV on with the sound low, and a group of strangers played cards at a nearby table. We ordered wine. No one spoke. Lucy fiddled with the rim of her glass. Andrew stared out the window, and I watched how the steam from the wine formed a faint circle in the air. Suddenly, Andrew turned to me and said he'd decided to leave the country, that he needed distance, that he couldn't stay in that house where every object seemed to carry his father's voice. Lucy burst into tears, but I didn't. I looked at him and told him it was all right, that a mother doesn't hold on, she just walks alongside. "I'm not leaving you, Mom. I'm going towards myself," he said. We came back when it was already night. The house greeted us with the smell of smoke in our clothes. Lucy went up to her room without a word, and I stayed in the living room. The silence was heavy. I looked around and realized that at last it was empty, not just of people, but of orders, of fear, of everything that had held up the silence for so many years. I sat on the armchair and thought that maybe the real inheritance was this: learning to live with loneliness without feeling it as punishment. I lit a candle. The flame trembled, leaning toward the portrait still hanging on the wall. I stared at it for a long time, that face that had dominated everything and now seemed meaningless. I got up, took the frame down, and set it face down on the floor. In its place, I hung one of Andrew's watercolors, an open landscape, a horizon without figures. The air seemed to change. For a moment, I heard a distant thunderclap, and it felt like the house was breathing lighter. I went upstairs slowly. In the hallway, Arthur's room door was half open. I went in. The room was still the same, as if he could come back at any moment. The books lined up, the pocket watch on the table, the clothes neatly folded. I opened a drawer and took out a small wooden box. Inside were photographs, coins, an old key. I rummaged through them without thinking, looking for something I didn't know how to name. I found a piece of paper with a phrase written in his hand. "Nothing I loved was ever completely mine." I read it several times. I didn't know if he'd written it out of remorse or clarity. Maybe, in the end, both are the same thing. I left the room and closed the door. In the hallway, I stopped and listened to the wind beating against the window panes. For a moment, I thought I heard his voice, but not. Like before, not authoritarian or cold, but distant, human. I didn't know if it was memory or my own desire to end it all once and for all. I went back downstairs, put out the candle, and opened the windows. The icy air rushed in and took with it the smell of smoke, dust, and memories. I stood by the open door, looking out into the darkness of the garden. I thought of Andrew, of his journey, of the letter inside the coffin, of the words we never read, of the possibility that, in the end, the only thing we inherit is the need to tell the truth, even if it comes late. And as the wind shook the lemon tree branches, I realized that maybe that was the peace I'd always been searching for. Not the peace of the dead, but of the living who finally dare to let go. The silence after the final burial settled in like a physical presence, a kind of pause that seemed to stretch through every room. The days started to pass without being marked. No Sundays or Mondays, just a succession of changing, light on the furniture. Sometimes I woke up thinking I heard footsteps in the hallway, but it was the wind, or the echo of the previous days, still wandering around the corners. Mark never called again. Lucy visited me from time to time with that quiet tenderness that doesn't try to fix anything, just to be there. And Andrew must have been far away by then, maybe in some foreign city where no one knew his surname. The will papers were still on the table, though I no longer looked at them. They had stopped meaning anything. They were just old sheets, witnesses to a battle that had finally ended. One morning, while I was sweeping the dust that had gathered under the radiators, I heard the doorbell. It was Lucy, with my granddaughter Sophie. I hadn't seen her in months. She had grown, her gaze was firmer, her hair now loose. She carried a notebook under her arm and a shy smile. Lucy said they wanted to spend the day with me, that the girl was doing a school project about the Blanc family's history. I nodded and invited them in. Sophie looked around with that curiosity of someone walking into a museum filled with things she doesn't quite understand. She stopped in front of the new painting, Andrew's, and asked who had painted it. "Your uncle," I said, "the one who left to go look for another kind of light." She nodded and said she liked it because it looked like a place where nothing had happened yet. We had lunch together, and for the first time in a long time, I heard real laughter in the house. Lucy spoke little, as if she still chose her words carefully, but her eyes were calm. Sophie asked me questions about her grandfather, about what he was like when he was young, whether he had a good sense of humor, if he danced. I told her the truth without embellishing it, that he danced little, that he had the humor of someone who always wants to be right, that he was a complicated man. She listened attentively, without judging. Then she asked if he had loved me. I hesitated before answering. "In his own way," I said. Although sometimes love, when it wants to control too much, ends up looking a lot like fear. She frowned and wrote something in her notebook. Later, while Lucy took a nap on the sofa, Sophie came to my room. She said she wanted to see the old books. I pointed her to the bookshelf and left her alone for a moment. When I came back, I found her sitting on the floor, holding a piece of paper. She looked at me with those eyes that seemed to read more than they showed and said, "This was inside the poetry book." I went closer. It was the draft of the letter, the one I'd kept before the burial. I recognized it immediately. The blue ink, the cross-outs, the sentences I never should have written and yet did. I felt a shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. Sophie didn't ask anything. She just folded it carefully and handed it to me. "Do you want me to keep it?" she asked. I told her yes, to keep it, that it was hers. "Why mine?" she asked. "Because you'll know what to do with it when the time comes." She didn't insist. She slipped it between the pages of her notebook, and I knew she wouldn't show it to anyone. She had understood the value of silences without me having to explain it. When Lucy woke up, we made tea and went out to the garden. The lemon tree had new shoots, tiny green points among the dry branches. The air smelled of old rain and fresh earth. Lucy talked about her plans to move, to find a smaller place. She said she was afraid of leaving me alone, and I told her I wasn't alone, that I had learned to listen to the house, and it no longer scared me. "And what will you do with all this?" she asked, looking around. "Nothing," I said. "Let it be. Sometimes the best thing a story can do is stay still." Sophie went up to the lemon tree and picked a small, still green fruit. She said she wanted to plant a seed from it in their yard so another tree could grow there. I watched her tuck the lemon into her backpack, and in that gesture I saw something like continuity, a kind of repair that doesn't need words or ceremonies. Lucy smiled. There was a serenity in her face I hadn't seen since she was a child. When they left, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, clean, different. I went to the living room, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window. Outside, the sky was opening after the rain, and the last rays of sunlight fell over the garden like a soft goodbye. I thought of Arthur, of Julia, of all those who were no longer here. I thought of my children, of their twisted lives, of each one's attempt to come to terms with their past. And I thought of myself, of the woman I had been, the one who kept quiet, the one who wrote, the one who lied so she could tell the truth. I didn't feel guilty. I felt a strange kind of gratitude, as if all that chaos had been necessary to reach that moment. I took a new notebook from a drawer and started writing, not really knowing why, maybe out of habit, maybe out of need. I didn't write about him or about my children. I wrote about the house, about the smell of coffee, about the rain and the clocks, about the exact moment when a person stops obeying fear. Night came slowly. I turned off the lights, left the window open, and listened to the sounds outside. Crickets, the wind, a distant laugh. In that murmur, I recognized something like life. Before closing the notebook, I wrote one last sentence, without thinking too much. They didn't inherit money, but I left them something better, the truth they couldn't buy. I set the pen down, I took a deep breath, and for the first time since all this began, I felt the story no longer belonged to me. It had gone off with them, with the granddaughter who kept the letter and the children who, in their own ways, were beginning to understand. I stared into the darkness until sleep came. Suddenly, not as an escape, but as rest. Outside, the lemon tree barely moved, and its shadow, drawn by the moon, looked like the silhouette of a new tree growing in the same place where before there had only been silence. And that's how it all ended, or rather, how it finally began. Sometimes an entire life fits into a letter, and other times you have to lose everything to be able to tell it without fear. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to me, for staying with me through this piece of truth I kept hidden for so many years. And now I'm curious, what would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I want to read you. And if you were left wanting more stories like this, the kind that feels so real they hurt a little, hit subscribe.